Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Ashley Wilcott.
And I'm Michael Ayala. We're both here today giving you your front row seat to justice. After nearly 4 weeks of testimony, the burn pile murder trial for Melody Farris will soon be coming to a close. Closing
arguments are set to begin tomorrow morning, and then it will be up to the jury to decide whether Farris killed her husband or if maybe one of her 4 children are to blame.
Prosecutors say Farris killed prominent Atlanta attorney Gary Farris in the basement of their home and then burned his remains in the backyard.
But the defense says Farris would not have been able to move her husband's nearly 300-pound body and that her one son in particular had financial motive to kill his dad. Joining us live now from Canton, Georgia is Court TV crime and justice correspondent Matt Johnson. Thank you, Matt, for joining us both today. The defense case rested after an expert witness.
Ashley, Michael, good afternoon. So it was a bombshell key testimony witness that took the stand today, as you mentioned, after almost 4 weeks of testimony here in Cherokee County, Georgia, above Atlanta, where this is all playing out. You have Melody Farris, the defendant, saying that she didn't kill her husband, and her defense team called an expert that was competing in theories and ideas as to how her husband died. Take a listen.
Can you make to a medical certainty a finding as what the cause of death was for Gary Farris?
I cannot. I cannot tell you to medical certainty that the projectile found in his chest wall soft tissue was the cause of his death. As far as I understand, we do not have definitive evidence of how Mr. Farris ended up in that fire, and we do not have evidence that an accelerant was used to try to burn him up. Frankly, I think the intellectually honest conclusion here is that his manner of death is undetermined as well.
Here in this case, I listed the manner of death as homicide because we had police investigation that there was no evidence that this was a natural death. There was no evidence that this was an accidental death, and there was no evidence that this was a suicidal death. So it was apparent that he was shot by another individual. Therefore, we relayed to the coroner to sign the death certificate as cause of death, gunshot wound of torso, and manner of death homicide, because that was the reasonable conclusion to make given the facts that we had.
So you have the 2 forensic pathologists there back to back as we edited them, but you know, this jury is going to have to look back to their notes from when the state's witness with the GBI testified, and that was on October 14th. But they take lots of notes, and they are very engaged in this trial process so far, so I wouldn't be surprised if after we get a verdict, if they tell us that they reviewed those notes.
No question about it. And Matt, you've been in the courtroom. What other evidence and testimony has stood out to you thus far?
Right, so there is a lot to go over with this jury. So it's almost 4 weeks of testimony, 44 witnesses. That includes the lovers that took the stand from both sides, because you had an open marriage here where both the victim and also this defendant was sleeping with other people. They had several lovers take the stand. And then we also heard from the Farris children, including Scott, Chris, and Emily, who were state witnesses, and they were in week 1. They all broke down on the stand, but then there was that extra emotional testimony that was really eventful for everyone that was in the courtroom with Amanda. She testified for the defense, called by the defense. She believes that her mom did not kill her father, and spoke about the dysfunction in the family, what she called a breakdown of the Farris will. Take a listen.
A lot of things that happened before that moment that I think should have been taken care of before just putting money on it to fix it. Okay. I think a lot of things that have happened in our family get swept under the rug, and they're never addressed, and they're not taken seriously. But a sin is a sin, and I feel like this is a repercussion of all the sins that were committed over years, unfortunately.
This is sins by everybody in the
Everybody.
family?
False money idols. It was always what it looked like on the outside. It never mattered what it was on the inside.
There's a lot of key evidence in this case that this jury is going to get back with them in the jury room as they deliberate and also have to consider. But some of the things that stick out with the prosecution's case in chief, at least, is the bullets and the projectiles, the blood droplets, pictures of that throughout the house, the jail calls. There was several days of calls and testimony about that. The police interviews with this defendant when she was confronted by the GBI and told by investigators that her story didn't add up. And then, of course, that jury view, which we don't always see in a case. And a lot of times that's done before opening statements or shortly after or right at the conclusion before all of the evidence is in. But in this particular case, that was in the middle of this trial.
All right, we know, Matt, they ended early today, a little earlier than maybe expected. What are we expecting tomorrow in this case?
Wow, it all comes down to this, right? The closing remarks from the attorneys on both sides. And we expect attorneys to take at least 2 hours for each side. We know that the prosecution, they are going to split their time in half. So they're going to put on a rebuttal of their closing remarks after the defense presents what they consider to be the highlights from the evidence that they presented. We expect the state to really double down on the money motive, premeditated and planning with her lover. Remember, she was arrested in Tennessee when she was with Rusty, her lover. And we also expect the defense to talk about all of the evidence that they say doesn't add up and points to Scott, much like opening statements. Take a listen.
You are going to hear the 911 call here shortly. That's the first thing we're going to do. I'm going to play you the 911 call. 13 minutes after law enforcement arrives, Scott Farris is already blaming his mother. Something is always going on with Chris, Scott, and Emily. And it's true. All the time. All the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. But you're going to see text messages. Gary mad that they're blowing money. Chris can't survive on his own, always needing money. Scott, a grown man, can't survive on his own, always needing money. Coming to get mama's credit card so he can go get some money out. Emily with her turmoil with her new husband and all that. In fact, you're also going to hear that Gary and Melody had to buy Emily and her husband the house up in Tennessee where they live. There was a lot of turmoil in this family.
When you shrink the world to the only person that had the motive was her, she said, Gary's in the burn pile. No. She said, he is in the burn pile. And I said, what? And she said, he is in the burn pile. I said, do not say another word and do not tell me anything. I do not need to know that. His presence and companionship is with the defendant. Law enforcement goes, gets arrest warrants, goes up to Tullahoma, Tennessee to arrest her. And guess who she's with? Rusty.
And here is the jury makeup right now. So 16 people for the last 4 weeks have heard the evidence in the box. That includes 9 men and 7 women that have heard all of this testimony and all of this evidence. Tomorrow, right before the closing arguments, we expect the deliberating jury of 12 to be selected by this judge.
All right, thank you so much, Matt Johnson. Always appreciate your great reporting. Now let's welcome our guest for this hour, trial attorney Gene Rossi. Always appreciate you as well, Gene. Before we get into some of the details, and I'd love to say what I think about this trial, I want to hear what you think, having listened to the evidence and I think a really strong defense. Where do you think we stand in this case?
Well, anytime you have a murder like this, allegedly a wife murdering her husband, the first thing I do is look at motive. And the motive here could be money. It could be the defendant was upset that her husband was giving all this money to the children, and she felt that she probably had an entitlement to that. Second motive is, of course, her affair with the Mr. Rusty Barton. And 1 year after the murder, she was arrested at his home in Tennessee. But what I'd like to know is, what did the jury think about these jail calls that they introduced? I've had many cases when I was a prosecutor where I used to love jail calls, and I assume the jail calls involved the defendant. So what do they think of those jail calls? But the last thing is, if I'm the defense, one of the holes in this case is confirmation bias. why did they not do a search warrant of the apartment in the barn of Scott Farris? They basically gave him a pass. They didn't search for any blood. They didn't search for any forensic evidence. And the last point I want to make is when you have two experts, one for the government and one for the defense, that can fly in a civil case. But in a criminal case, when you have the battle of experts about how somebody died, there's reasonable doubt there because it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not preponderance. So that's what I think of this case so far.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you make some great points, and I agree with them all, with the exception of they did look in Scott's area where he stood in that, I guess you'll call it an apartment, something along that line.
On the property.
And that's where they found 38 special bullets, which is the type of bullet that was used in this case. They couldn't necessarily match them, but that was an interesting fact as well. But the other interesting thing I found today, and we had debated this over the course of the weeks, whether she would take the stand and testify in her own defense, whether she needed to get up there and tell her story. Things seem to be shifting, Jan. I don't know if you noticed this at all, but more and more defendants, I think, feel they need to or want to tell their story. And I wonder if juries feel that same way. They want to hear from them. Does that hurt her or help her?
Well, I've had two convictions, one where I didn't put on my client and one where I did, and they both were pain doctors. So I'm 0 for 2, okay? So I've had one case where I didn't put on my client, and here she was found guilty, a pain doctor. And at one other case, I put my client on, and here she was found guilty. So what do juries believe? I'll tell you this right now. I know they're told that a defendant has a right to not testify, but I just have this feeling juries want to hear from defendants. They do. Even though they're told they shouldn't hold it against the defendant, they always want to hear from the defendant. So for some jurors, it may have a subliminal positive or negative reaction, but I'm one that likes to take risk in my short criminal career as a defense attorney. If you have a good defendant who can withstand a vicious cross, you're going to put that person on. If you don't, then you never let them on the stand. And even when you think they're a good witness, even when you think your client's a good witness, and you prep them 4 or 5 times, vicious cross, I've done that. When they get on that stand in front of that jury, remarkable things happen. Their mouth may twitch, their eyes may flutter. I'm serious.
It's true.
I want to crawl under the table sometimes, but you never know how a defendant is going to react on the stand in real time. Prep is prep. It's practice, as Allen Iverson would say. It's practice.
Yep.
But putting them on a stand in front of a jury, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and it matters in basketball and it matters in trial practice as well. Practice is important.
Absolutely.